Yes, Hunter.
How you doing?
I'm all right. Did you just want to be on the lecture recording, Hunter?
You're recording this?
Yes. Way to pay attention. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. What about a TV monitor?
I said you got a mic like the people on WOWT.
Yes, it's called a lavalier mic. Okay. So, where was I yesterday? Henry VIII. Married Catherine of Aragon. Okay. So, we have to do the short version of this. I love English history too much. And I could make the lecture over this 5 days long, not just 2. And so I have to force myself to abbreviate. So we're just doing the first 3 wives. You can do Catherine with a K or a C. Okay. Henry marries Catherine of Aragon. And out of that marriage comes a child who is Mary. Now, 18 years of marriage has produced Mary and 5 other children, none of whom have lived to adulthood. The longest lived other child of this marriage is a son who lived 7 weeks. By the end of this time, Catherine is getting on in years. She is approaching that age where the likelihood of her conceiving and successfully carrying a child to term is decreasing. And so Henry decides he needs to be rid of her so that he can get that all-important heir to the throne. And Henry, more than anybody else, understands that he needs not only an heir, but he needs a spare. Because Henry himself was a spare, right? Now, remember when Henry married Catherine, I told you something very specific about that marriage. He had to go to the Pope and get special permission to marry his brother's widow. Remember that? Okay. So Henry now goes to the Pope and asks for permission to divorce. And the Pope says, no. 18 years, child, there's no divorce. Divorce was very, 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 very rare back then. Okay? So Henry stews for a while and broods for a while, and he goes to the Pope and he says, forget about that whole divorce thing. I get the divorce is wrong. We're Catholic. What I need is an annulment. An annulment. Do you guys know how to spell that? Should be in the book. He asks for an annulment. 1L2, 1L2, I'm not sure. We'll go with 1. Probably 2. An annulment means it's basically like a cancellation of the marriage. You go back and you basically apply whiteout to the marriage. And the Pope says, annulments are usually only given in cases where the marriage was an utter mistake and it hasn't been consummated. Do you know what it means to consummate a marriage? Honeymoon time. Okay? Clearly, you, having produced 6 children, whether they lived or not, have consummated this marriage. And you asked for special permission. There's another concept called papal infallibility that is a problem here. While this is a different pope now, 18 years later, than the one who initially gave permission to get married, the concept of papal infallibility still applies. Does anybody know what that means? Rena?
Pope is right. If the Pope is wrong, please refer to rule number 1.
That is correct. The Pope is right. If the Pope is wrong, please refer to the prior rule. The Pope can't be wrong. The Pope's chosen by God. The Pope speaks for God. God isn't wrong, so the Pope isn't wrong. So if this current Pope granted Henry the annulment, because Henry's asking for the annulment on the basis of God has refused to give me a son because he believes it was wrong that I married my wife, who was my brother's wife. And that's just creepy. Remember your reaction yesterday when I told you he married his brother's widow? Yeah. Exactly. Henry now, 18 years later, is going, ugh, and saying that's why God won't give us a son. And this Pope is saying, nope. Pope before me said it was okie dokie, so it's okie dokie. And Henry says, but God hasn't given us a son, so he's not okie dokie with this. And the Pope says, refer to rule number 1. Pope's always right. No annulment. So, and Henry didn't actually go to the Pope. Let's be clear about that. He sent an emissary. Okay? He sent a representative by the name of Thomas Wolsey. You don't have to memorize him. Wolsey comes home and he says to Henry, Pope said no, and he's not going to change his mind. And Henry flies into a rage. Okay? Ultimately, the conclusion is that Henry will leave the Catholic Church. And when I say Henry, I mean all of England. Will leave the Catholic Church. And he forms, or he creates what? The Church of England. And there are two main differences between the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. Difference number 1, in the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope is the boss. In the Church of England, Henry is the boss. Difference number 2, in the Roman Catholic Church, the Bible is in Latin. In the Church of England, the Bible is in English. The service is the same, the beliefs are the same, the practices are the same. Henry's the boss, Bible's in English. There's your differences. You can't even call it a diet version of the Roman Catholic Church. It's not even Roman Catholic Church 10. It's like you let the ice melt in your Roman Catholic Church. It's diluted not even that much. Okay? So now, as head of the Church of England, what can Henry do? He can annul that marriage. Yay, it never happened. Now this creates a huge problem, not for Catherine, because Henry's already assured her he's going to take care of her. She stays in England. She's treated as the queen. She's good. It's rain. It happens. It's when water falls from the sky. Okay. But when there is no marriage, what does that mean for the children of that union? Mary is now a bastard. She has no father because the marriage never happened. Mary is angry. Angry, angry, angry. Resentful. Unhappy. And let's put up here what this religion was while we were here. Part of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? So now Henry still needs his heir and a spare. While he was working on this whole divorce or annulment or just get rid of the old bag issue, he was already in lust with another young woman, the younger sister of one of his mistresses. By the way, it's perfectly okay. Yes, sir? Yes, ma'am?
Did you say that Catherine was Roman Catholic?
Yes. She's from Spain. Spain is very Catholic. Mary is thus Catholic. Yes. Henry was even Catholic during all that time. And then, just like this, he's not. Okay. So Henry has met a young woman. the younger sister of one of his mistresses. And it's perfectly okay for kings to have lots of mistresses. Kings, whatever. They just don't acknowledge the children of those marriages. Because if they did acknowledge that's my kid,
They become king.
then that kid has a somewhat valid claim on the throne. And Henry is one of the first kings of England to come to the throne without having to fight for it. And so he doesn't want to jeopardize that for any of his children. So we know the name even of one of his bastard sons, Hugh Fitzroy. He gets titled, he has land, he lives a good life. Henry provides for him, but he never says, that's my boy. Okay? So that Fitzroy doesn't have a claim on the throne. Okay? So Henry had no problem having sons, he just had a problem having sons with his wives. So one of his mistresses is a young woman by the name of Mary Boleyn. And she enjoys the power that she has at court for sleeping with the king. Her father becomes one of Henry's important advisors. There are perks to entertaining the monarch. One of those perks is that her sister, who had been a lady-in-waiting to the Queen of France, Henry goes over there for some peace negotiations, and Anne Boleyn catches his eye, and she's kind of exotic. She has these really kind of, I would think it was creepy, but eyes so dark they almost look like they're black. Jet black hair. She's just a real beauty and exotic. And she toys with him, and she teases him, and she flirts, and she leads him on to the point where he is like a dog at the end of its leash, just and she refuses him. She will not entertain until she's married to him. And that only further incentivizes him to get rid of Catherine. Henry will, after the annulment, marry Anne Boleyn. Remarkably, once the annulment was in place and they were betrothed, Anne stopped resisting, and so by the time they're actually married, she is quite pregnant. And so there is a child born of this marriage. Its name is Elizabeth. Henry is delighted. This wife is still fertile and can deliver a very healthy baby. And Elizabeth looks like Henry. She has gorgeous flaming red hair, almost orange red hair. And as she grows, she has Henry's personality too. She's feisty and opinionated and a little fiery tempered. And very quickly gets pregnant again. Stillborn boy. She fairly quickly gets pregnant again. She is out watching Henry. Henry was not big on the actual kinging part, the ruling part of being king. He liked to play. And remember, he wasn't raised to be the king. He composed music, he jousted, he hunted. Anne is watching him in a joust, and he is unhorsed, as it said. He actually gets knocked off of the horse and is unconscious and is wounded. And at that time, Anne receives a huge shock from that. She's terrorized because her place at court is still not very secure. This change to the Church of England has upset things. People loved Catherine of Aragon. She was the crowned Queen of England. Anne is seen as a usurper and a snake in the grass and the other woman. And so if Henry is dying, Anne has yet to produce a son, which means she's not going to be the mother of the future king. And so Henry needs to be okay. Well, the best assumption we can make is that the shock and the trauma and the emotional stress of Henry's unhorsing at the joust causes Anne's miscarriage, because within a couple of days she miscarries, and she was far enough along, it was a son. At this point, Henry is beginning to lose interest. He's very frustrated with Anne. Since the accident, she's gotten very clingy and very whiny, and he is just like, get away from me, I don't want to hear it. And Anne loved to be entertained. She wasn't very intellectual. She always had a bunch of poets and musicians around in her chambers, and some of those musicians are spending too much time with her and taking long walks in the garden because Henry doesn't have time for Anne anymore. You know, he's no longer pulling at the end of that leash, as it were. And so when Henry decides Anne's not about to produce a son for him, he has to come up with a reason to get rid of her. And it would be in bad form for him to annul that marriage right after he just annulled this other one. And since she's already making people talk, why not lead them to believe something that they already kind of think is true anyway? And so he charges her with entertaining behind his back. And while that's fine for a king, it's a problem for a queen. Why can't the queen entertain other men?
Because if she gets pregnant, then they can claim the child.
If she is pregnant, how can we prove that it is the king's and that it's a legitimate heir to the throne if she is known to have entertained other men? So, entertaining other men is an act of treason if you are the consort of the king. And so Anne is thrown in the Tower of London and will ultimately lose her head. No divorce necessary. It's like a do-your-own-divorce kit. So Henry now needs another wife because he still needs his heir and hopefully a spare. And so this time he marries Jane Seymour. Come on down, you're the next contestant in The King's Wife. All right, so Jane Seymour. Oh my gosh, Henry actually loves her. He married Catherine of Aragon out of obligation to his father. He marries Anne Boleyn out of lust. He will marry Jane Seymour out of love. And within no time, he marries Jane Seymour. She very quickly conceives and a child is born. Edward. And within a matter of days, she dies of complications from childbirth. Henry is rejoicing at an heir to the throne and crushed at the loss of his love.
Did he still have mistresses?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The old line goes, the king never sleeps alone. Sometimes the king was known to go from chamber to chamber, as it were. At the end of his life, you all know the pictures of King Henry, big, huge, fat man, right? It is said that King Henry was a man of great appetites. Okay, so when Henry dies, Edward is a very young man. All right, we're going to skip the three other wives. They don't matter because they didn't give us our spare. Okay, they happen. Can't deny that. But when Henry dies, Edward comes to the throne, and he becomes Edward, not the first, Edward the Sixth. There have been 5 Edwards before him.
Do they only get the number after they're
That's correct. Yeah. They only get the number after they become king because he is thus the 6th Edward to rule England. Okay, so Edward the Sixth becomes king. Now, Edward is young. And he's always been kind of sickly. He is not his father's son. He's not a hunter and a jouster and a dancer. He's just kind of, he would not have made the freshman B team in anything. Yeah, I know. They kind of all his life wondered if he was going to make it. Okay, he would be the asthma inhaling, EpiPen carrying, getting pushed and shoved, bullied kind of kid today. So because he is that kind of guy, he is very susceptible to the influences of his advisors, left to him by Henry. Now, Henry was a very powerful, a very decisive king. While he didn't like to rule, he did when he had to. He refused to separate more from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? He was afraid of angering two very powerful and very Catholic nations on the continent, and that's France and Spain. If Henry had gone 180 degrees away from the Roman Catholic Church, France and Spain would have been like, oh, get you. Especially with Catherine still living in England. Spain would have been very unhappy. Edward could care less about a stepmother. A stepmother? I don't know how that works when there's multiple. But anyway, she actually doesn't even exist in his mind, I guess. I don't know. She helped to raise him, but anyway, because his mother died and Anne was dead, so ironically, Catherine ends up raising both of Henry's other children. Awkward. Yeah, Christmases were not. You think your family has trouble? All right. So Edward takes the Church of England much further away from Roman Catholicism. The Book of Common Prayer is written under under Edward's rule. He abolishes iconography from the Church of England. That's the statues and the pictures of saints and stuff. Those are gone. Let's get rid of the incense and all the ritual. He really does begin to separate England from the Catholic Church and begins some persecution of the Catholics. Henry had been cautious. He did not want to antagonize those Catholic nations. And so while England was Church of England, he left the Catholics alone, just because he had only flipped sides out of convenience. He was still kind of a Catholic at heart. Okay. Edward, on the other hand, has been raised Protestant from the beginning and believes wholly in Protestantism and hates the Papists, as Catholics are called, because they follow the Pope. Edward, having been born into being the head of his own church and his own country, sees the Pope as an opponent, as a challenge to his power. Because Catholics then have to decide, do I follow my king or do I follow my Pope? And so Edward would just rather not have to deal with the Catholics, and so he wants to force them all to the Church of England. Unfortunately, before he can finish his work, he dies. He gets sick and dies. Upon his death, the crown goes to one of Henry's other children. Which? Mary, the eldest of Henry's other children. This is a bit of a dance because she is still technically and legally not Henry's daughter because of the annulment. Elizabeth is technically first in line because her mother was actually married to Henry. There was no whiteout that accompanied the headsman's axe. But Edward names Mary as his heir. And so she becomes Mary the First. When she becomes Mary the First, England has a whole new set of problems. They got 99 problems and Martin Luther's one. They have 95 problems and Martin Luther's one. Okay? Mary is born under the Roman Catholic Church, and all her life she remains a Roman Catholic. And so when she becomes Queen of England, England too becomes Roman Catholic. When Henry separated from the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope excommunicated Henry and all of his dominion, meaning every English person was excommunicated. So Mary brings England back to the Catholic Church, and the Pope unexcommunicates England. Yay.
Just take it away.
Just take it away. Lift the bull of excommunication. Yep. Mary, though, has some work to do herself. She needs to get rid of all of these Protestant influences and all of the Protestant clergy and all of the Protestant practices and put Catholicism back into the hearts of her people. And so in order to do so, she has to get rid of some Protestants, make some examples of them. And she does so by trying them, because it's treason. If the king or if the queen says, be Catholic, and you aren't, or if you're caught being something else in private, that's treasonous because you're disobeying the queen. And she took particular pleasure, because these are heretics, not following Catholicism, she took particular pleasure in making sure that they were burned at the stake. That's a common punishment for a heretic, including Henry's trusted advisor Thomas Wolsey, who had composed the Book of English Common Prayer for Edward. You don't have to know Wolsey by name, no. That is where she gets her nickname, Bloody Mary, because England is certainly bloodied as she attempts to convert it back to Catholicism. Now, Mary understands her father's deep desire to provide an heir. By the way, Edward had married and didn't produce any offspring before his untimely death. Mary understands she needs an heir, because there's a certain inevitability. If Mary doesn't produce an heir, who's next in line? Elizabeth. And what is Elizabeth religiously? She's going to be Protestant. She was born under the Church of England. She's been raised as a Protestant. And Mary is terrified of the prospect that Elizabeth will take the throne and flip that religious light switch back to Protestantism. Question.
Is Mary allowed to persecute Elizabeth?
Is Mary allowed to persecute Elizabeth? Yes. But it is not shrewd of her to do so. What she does instead with Elizabeth is lock her away. She spends pretty much her, from about the age of 6 or 7 to 18 when she becomes queen, she's locked away in various castles, increasingly remote. She has a tutor and maybe a nurse. To the age where she doesn't need a nurse anymore. She's isolated. There are constantly plots against Mary because people don't like the persecution. They've gotten used to being Protestant. And so Elizabeth it's never possible to prove that Elizabeth was aware of or involved in any of those plots. And so Mary is never able to have her executed. But it's always just this needling, nagging worry and doubt and question in the back of Mary's mind. What's Elizabeth up to? Is she out to get me? Because Mary, remember the anger? Henry made her a bastard in order to marry Anne Boleyn. Well, Anne Boleyn's gone. But a constant reminder of Anne Boleyn is right there, living in England. And guess who is made to attend the birth of baby Elizabeth? Mary. Guess who is made to change Mary's diapers, or Elizabeth's diapers, and take care of her in the nursery? You've been stripped of your title as princess because the king is no longer your father, and here you're taking care of that little red-haired devil whose mother pushed yours out and made you a bastard. Can you imagine how much Mary must hate Elizabeth with all her heart and soul? So Elizabeth is too young to really understand much of that. As she got older, she figured it out. You know, she enters that awareness of teenage years, and she's like, oh, I get it. Yeah. And add to that the different and religious dynamics. That further complicates things. So Mary wants to provide an heir. And she agrees, being Catholic, to an available Catholic marriage to a gentleman by the name of Philip, who is King of Spain. Philip the First. He and Mary marry. He comes to England for the marriage. Now, in the pre-marriage negotiations, it is agreed that Philip will not be crowned the King of England. The British were concerned about that because by this time, England is a global sea power, and Spain definitely is because they have to take care of their colonies in the New World. What's your question?
Oh, you just answered it. I forgot that. If he's from Spain or not.
Oh yeah, he's uber Catholic. Philip is like Catholic extreme. He's like the Monster energy drink of Catholicism. Okay? He'll give you the Catholic shakes. So he comes over for the marriage and stays long enough to honeymoon for a while. Eventually he leaves when it's believed that Mary is pregnant. He does, after all, have his own entire country to run and all of those colonies. I mean, it's like half of the world at this point. So he goes back home. And Mary doesn't deliver the baby. And she doesn't deliver the baby. And pretty soon it's like, okay, yeah, I can tell time and I can count months and something's up here. Finally, it's discovered that Mary has induced in herself what's called a hysterical pregnancy, where with the power of your mind and belief, you can evoke physical symptoms in your own body, including things like morning sickness and distension of the belly. She so badly wanted to be pregnant and so badly believed that she must be that she was able to disrupt her cycles and evidence some of the physical characteristics of pregnancy and to believe that she was pregnant when she was not. So eventually that passes. She gets Philip to come back for a while. A few years later, he doesn't stay very long. By this time, Mary's getting up there in years. She's not a great beauty by any means. She had terrible teeth. They weren't big on oral hygiene back then anyway, but she'd always had bad teeth. She has digestive problems and eats a really weird diet because her teeth are so bad. And so when you have digestive problems, sometimes that affects your breath and rotting teeth and just... You did not want to stand very close to Mary when you were talking with her at all. Like the worst breath in the history of breath ever. Okay? Plus, she's oogly. So for Philip to come back and go on a second honeymoon must have been a real act of perseverance for him. He had to have very much wanted a Spaniard as an heir to the English throne because he envisioned then if this son of the Queen of England and the King of Spain takes this throne, he envisioned a united kingdom. He wanted that. And so that's why he stays for a little bit of a second honeymoon. He eventually can't take it anymore and goes back home, never to return again. Mary never again sees her husband. She does not conceive a child. She will eventually die after a long period of suffering. Her inability to conceive a child makes her even more pious and religious and even more extreme. She will spend hours and hours on her knees praying She'll spend most of the day in Mass and in services. She makes Elizabeth attend as she gets nearer to death. She moves Elizabeth to London and into her palace and makes Elizabeth attend with her, trying to force Elizabeth into Catholicism. Had Elizabeth at any time said, yes, I will convert to Catholicism, Mary would immediately have written in her will that Elizabeth was the heir to the throne. Elizabeth never would say that. She would attend, she would pray, she would keep her Protestant practices in the dark, but she would never say she would convert to Catholicism. So it is only on Mary's deathbed that Elizabeth is finally named heir to the throne, and upon Mary's death becomes Elizabeth I of England and switches England's religious channel back to Protestantism. Now, under Elizabeth, the Church of England becomes known as the Anglican Church, okay, and is not as extreme as Edward's Church of England. Elizabeth understands that after this relatively short flip-flopping of religions, the people of England are in turmoil. They have not been happy under Bloody Mary. So when she takes England back to the Church of England and creates the Anglican Church, she does not persecute vigorously the Catholics. Those who are rubbing her nose in the Catholicism, those who are flaunting it, they're going to see some trouble. But she doesn't go on huge Catholic roundups, and there's no mass burnings at the stake. Okay? It's a more peaceful transition. She leaves enough of the Catholic flavor, but still brings back the Protestantism. Okay? It's a good compromise. It keeps England intact. When it comes to an heir to the throne, Elizabeth was incredibly shrewd. She knew that she needed an heir to the throne, but decided that she would never have one. She decided that the bargaining chip of her marriage was more important. Who can she marry? She's a Protestant monarch. Can she marry the heir to the French throne? France is uber Catholic. Can she marry a Spaniard? Nope. She can't even marry a Scot. They're still, in terms of their monarchy, Catholic. A German prince? Possibly, but then what's that do? That pokes a finger in the eye of Spain and France. So what she does is, think of the cat toy where it's like this long plastic wand and a little string and a little ball of feathers, right? And you just kind of dance that in front of the cat and you throw it out there on the floor and then you tease it back towards you and the cat jumps and pounces and plays with it and it'll jump up and paw at it, right? This is what Elizabeth kept all of these other European countries who had their eye on this weak little queen running a country. She can't do that without a man by her side. Are you kidding me? She keeps them all pawing at the possibility of marriage with her until she would have to have been barren by age. And even then, they want to marry her because then they get to rule. She keeps young men pawing after her, even after she's clearly old and icky. Okay? Very smart for a woman. Okay?
So,
Yes?
who rules after her?
We will pick up English history after Elizabeth. Oh, no, don't pack up. I still have 5 more minutes and we have a whole half a section. Okay? We will pick up English history in a few chapters. I know, we just have to put the pause button on England. I know, it's a huge cliffhanger. It's awesome. History's full of them. Yes, Elizabeth will die without an heir. More at a later time. You have to wait for the sequel, England Part 2. The Dark Side of the Earth. Yes, if I remember the characters. You may have to reread the first version. Okay. Now, let's go and talk about the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. The Pope says, all right, Martin Luther and everything that he said and all of the repercussions for that are enough of a pain in my cushion-seated buttocks that I must do something to deal with them. And so he does what great leaders everywhere do when they need to confront an issue but don't actually want to deal with it. He calls a meeting. He calls a meeting. And it is called the Council of Trent. Now, the Council of Trent is not a put this on your calendar for Thursday at 2 o'clock and we'll be out of here in time for dinner kind of meeting. This thing drags on for about 20 years. 20 years. You know what they say? If pro is the opposite of con, then is Congress the opposite of progress? Right? The Council of Trent was pretty much the opposite of progress. Okay? The Council of Trent does, in their 20 years of sitting, make some decisions. They decide that the Bible is not the only source of religious truth. That addresses one of Martin Luther's complaints, right? Because he had gone back to the Bible and said, there's only 2 sacraments. You Catholics in your 7, you're full of bull. And the Pope issued a bull that excommunicated Martin Luther. Well, now the Council of Trent has addressed that. They said the Bible and tradition are both valid sources of religious practice and faith. So, Council of Trent validates those other 5 sacraments. Okay, fine. The Council of Trent says you can receive salvation by faith and good works. That had been a complaint of Martin Luther, right? He didn't believe in salvation by faith alone. He said you have to actually be a decent human being as well. And the Council of Trent basically does this to Martin Luther. Because what was Martin Luther's number 1 complaint? Indulgences. You cannot buy your way out of hell. There is no way in hell, says Martin Luther, that you should be able to buy your way out of hell. The Council of Trent says indulgences are a valid practice of faith. And at the same time they say, but we have to clean up the corruption in the church. And when they're saying that, they're saying indulgences shouldn't be sold to enrich the monks and the priests and the Pope. They should be sold for valid religious reasons. So no pre-buying your way out of hell. Yes, you now have to rely on your family to do it for you afterwards. Yes. I will throw out here, because you do have to know him, a fellow by the name of Ignatius of Loyola, and the group he created, which is the Society of Jesus, and their nickname is the Jesuits. You need to know what they do. You do not need to know Teresa.
Oh.
Yay!
And then there was much rejoicing.